You could be asked a number of questions regarding Wolsey. Firstly, you could be asked about how he rose to power, what were the biggest reasons for his rise to power. You could also be asked questions about Wolsey and domestic policy, how successful was the domestic policy, and how much influence he had in the domestic policy. Apart from Henry, and also you could be asked questions about his downfall and why in the end he ended up out of favour with Henry. Here is a essay exemplar looking at the reasons why Wolsey came to power. It's dealing with all the different factors that were on the previous slide. There is also useful information in your orange textbook as well. In terms of looking at him and Henry's domestic policy, the important thing that you have to really realise is that it is Wolsey who is leading the domestic policy. Henry isn't that involved. He is quite happy to let Wolsey get on with it. He's not like his father that was very much more involved in policy. Henry tends to take a back seat. However, he does have certain things that he wants to happen, and this is up to Wolsey to do this. In terms of looking at the domestic policy, you need to think about what were Wolsey's aims and then make a judgment on how successfully he completed these aims. There were quite a lot of different aims, and one of the biggest ones has to be pleasing Henry. Whilst Henry isn't that involved in it, as I've already said, he did have certain things that he wanted to get done. So Wolsey has to give Henry what he wants, because this is where all of Wolsey's power comes from. And it is Henry who gives Wolsey the power, and he can take it away. So if Wolsey wants to stay and have this power and influence, he needs to give Henry what he wants. One of the biggest things that Henry wants, essentially, is to be able to fight and to be able to go to war, especially against the French. So one of the biggest aims Wolsey has is to raise revenue. And you can argue that he is successful to a point in this, but not completely, because in the end he isn't able to give Henry what he wants, which is another war with France. Other aims of Wolsey's is to gain personal prestige and wealth. So he is very sort of power conscious, very wealth conscious, and he wants to have a certain amount of power. And this can be linked into this idea of also he wants to take power away from the nobility and give him the power. And him and the nobility do not have a good relationship at all. Now, this is partly, you can argue, the nobles' fault, because the nobles don't warm to Wolsey. They feel that it's up to their job. It's their job to guide Henry, not this upstart who's not even a noble. However, Wolsey makes it worse. He keeps grudges, he antagonizes the nobles, and he definitely tries to take power away from them and give him more power. Another aim, though, is to improve the governing of the country. What does that mean? It means in terms of law, make law more efficient, make central government more efficient, and also to make sure that the provinces and local areas are still tightly controlled by central government, and that everything that Henry and Wolsey wants to happen with it throughout the country is actually happening. Also, another aim, remember, is Wolsey does come from modest roots, so he definitely does want to help the people, and there is quite a lot of evidence of him doing things that are going to help the normal people. However, the judgment to make with this, I think, is the fact that this is an aim, but as long as it doesn't get in the way of some of his other aims, for example, pleasing Henry, having his own personal prestige, and even possibly in order to be controlling the nobility. So helping normal people is an aim, but it is one that he wants to do only if it doesn't get in the way of some of his other aims. Wolsey made quite a lot of changes in law in order to try to make it more efficient and to make it quicker. And up to a point, he was definitely successful. And he also wanted to change some of the things in law in order to make it quicker and easier for normal people to gain justice, which can be seen as a positive thing. He also got rid of land enclosures, which was seen as really a good thing for normal people, and they were really pleased with this. The nobility didn't like this, and this was seen as a disadvantage to the nobles. Now, you can make the judgment as to, did he do this in order to help people, or was it as an opportunity to, again, sort of make life difficult for the nobles? This is a judgment that you could think about and could make. Again, in terms of the government, he wanted to make things efficient. And he wanted to make sure that there was central control, so everything that Henry and him wanted to happen within the country was happening as well. He can be one of the big things he did was the Eltham ordinances, which was trying to sort of make life more efficient. And one of the things within that was he reduced the size of the Privy Council from 12 to 6. Now, he would argue he did that in order to try to make it easier for decision making to happen. However, it can also be pointed out that this did mean that he had more power because he was one of 6 rather than one of 12. And also it meant that there were less nobles in the Privy Council, which obviously would have meant, and there would have been less nobles with control and influence, which would have suited him as well. It can be seen that he was a little bit petty with the nobles in terms of government. He would send nobles out to the countryside to do jobs if he didn't like them or if he felt threatened by them. So in terms of government and administration, he did sort of isolate quite a lot of the nobility as well. Wolsey did centralise the church, which you could say made it more organised. However, there was sort of corruption to a point within the church, and Wolsey definitely didn't do anything about that. And as he says, if only I'd served God as diligently as I have done the king. And he himself, you can say, was part of the corruption. He had more than one job. He was head of a monastery, even though he wasn't a monk. So he definitely sort of benefited from the corruption of the church at the time. As has already been stated, Wolsey's power comes from Henry, so he needs to give Henry what he wants. And Henry predominantly wants to be able to go to war against France. Now, at one point, Wolsey tries to get money from Parliament, and Parliament says no. This creates tension between Wolsey and Parliament, but in the end, Wolsey decides to raise the money through an amicable grant. However, this proved very unpopular, and there are uprisings. And in the end, Wolsey can't raise the money, and so Henry can't go to war. And you can argue that this is a starting point of Henry starting to get slightly fed up with Wolsey because Wolsey isn't able to give Henry what he wants. Also, the fact that there are uprisings in the country, and the fact that the Parliament and relationships between Wolsey and Parliament aren't that great. This is a starting point, I think, for Wolsey's downfall. In terms of relationships with Parliament, they weren't great. A lot of the Parliament is made up of nobles, remember, and Wolsey has antagonised the nobles. And he only called Parliament twice. However, whilst you can criticise Wolsey for this, you can also argue that Wolsey, in the end, doesn't need the Parliament. He doesn't want to go to Parliament. So he is able to almost sort of ignore Parliament and do what he wants. So in a way, you can argue that this is quite successful. Wolsey not being able to gain a divorce, you can use in 2 different types of essays. You can use firstly in a domestic policy and argue that he is not completely successful in domestic policy because he cannot give Henry what he wants. An example being raising money for war, but also he can't give Henry a divorce, which is ultimately what he wants. Also, you can look at the divorce in terms of this is another reason why Wolsey is, in the end, there is a breakdown of relationship and there's a downfall of Wolsey because he isn't giving Henry what he wants, which is the divorce. So, as I already said, one of the essays you could get would be looking at how successful Wolsey was in terms of his domestic policy, and you need to link that with the aims, which was in one of the other slides in the PowerPoint. But another type of essay you can get is to look at what led to Wolsey's downfall. And essentially, there are 6 different reasons why Wolsey eventually wasn't in favour anymore with Henry. I think you can say the thing that underpins all of this is this idea of Wolsey's power comes from Henry. So as soon as Henry isn't pleased with Wolsey anymore, then it's all going to fall apart. And you can argue the main reasons why Henry falls out of love, essentially, with Wolsey is because of him not being able to go to war, and also the fact that Wolsey isn't able to give him the divorce. But linking to this is this idea as well. You can talk about the factions and nobility, this idea that Wolsey had alienated the nobility. So when Henry starts to get fed up with Wolsey, the nobility don't defend Wolsey. They actually encourage Henry. They do not have any loyalty to Wolsey. And you can argue if Wolsey had maybe tried to develop more of a relationship with the nobility, they would have defended him when he started to have problems with Henry, but they don't. So that is another judgment that you can put in place. This is a classic essay that you could get for understanding the downfall of Thomas Wolsey, and I would suggest that you at least plan it and then maybe write it out in timed conditions. Give yourself 35 minutes, and then I'm sure one of your junior history teachers will be able to mark it for you.